What happens when a civilization becomes so afraid of being outpaced, outgunned, or outimagined that it begins to hide its boldest questions from itself? History usually introduces itself with dates, treaties, and official statements. But behind those polished surfaces, there is another history made of sealed folders, vanished budgets, and rooms without windows. It is a history shaped not only by what nations build, but by what they choose to bury. In the 20th century, as war accelerated science and fear sharpened ambition, governments learned to think on two levels at once. One story was prepared for the public. The other moved quietly through restricted laboratories, desert test ranges, isolated coastlines, and forgotten facilities at the edge of maps. Some of those hidden efforts were real and documented. Others survive as fragments, rumors, testimony, and uneasy memory. Together, they form something larger than a catalog of secret programs. They reveal a pattern in the modern imagination, the urge to push beyond the known and the equal urge to conceal what is found there. Not every claim can be proven. Not every witness can be trusted, and yet doubt itself becomes part of the story because secrecy does not only hide facts, it also reshapes the boundary between truth and disbelief. This journey is not about proving every legend or endorsing every whisper that survived the Cold War and its aftermath. It is about entering the atmosphere that made such experiments conceivable, an atmosphere of rivalry, ingenuity, and moral fog. A time when the human mind, the sky above us, the moon, the oceans, even memory itself could be reimagined as terrain to be studied, manipulated, or weaponized. And so we begin there, in that uneasy borderland between record and rumor, where science meets fear and wonder is pressed into service. Because sometimes the most revealing thing about a secret is not whether it happened exactly as told, but why so many people believed it could. What if the first crack in the story appeared not in a document, but in the air itself? On the eastern tip of Long Island, where wind moves through scrub pine and the Atlantic keeps its own stern counsel, Camp Hero still sits above the shoreline like an unfinished sentence. Visitors come for the cliffs, the old concrete, the view. But for decades, another image has lingered there. A radar station that, according to later testimony, became something stranger than a military outpost. Not a battlefield, a threshold. The story often begins in the early 1980s with technicians, contractors, and scattered witnesses describing equipment failures, unusual electromagnetic effects, and a mood of sudden secrecy around the site. Maintenance records, they said, grew irregular, access narrowed, conversations stopped mid-sentence. From those fragments emerged the legend of the Montauk Project, an alleged covert program devoted to the edges of the mind, telepathy, psychological conditioning, remote influence, perhaps even experiments involving time itself. At the center of the mythology was a device sometimes called the Montauk Chair. In the accounts that survive, it was said to amplify thought, turning imagination into a kind of instrument. Some versions claim subjects could perceive distant places. Others suggest memory was altered, suppressed, or rewritten. The most dramatic testimonies describe a catastrophic event in 1983 when an experiment supposedly spun beyond control and forced the facility into sudden silence. None of this has been verified in a way historians would call conclusive. Official records do not confirm the program. Many researchers treat the story as folklore built from Cold War anxiety, damaged memory, and the natural magnetism of abandoned military spaces. And yet the persistence of the tale matters, because Montauk, whether literal fact or cultural mirror, asks a difficult question. When power studies the human mind in secret, what becomes harder to recover first, the evidence or the self? It began, as so many technological dreams do, with a horizon that looked almost within reach. In the years after the Second World War, the United States entered an era of feverish invention. Engineers were asked to imagine aircraft that could go higher, faster, and farther than anything before them. The sky was no longer just a route between continents. It had become a strategic frontier, a place where altitude itself meant advantage. Somewhere inside that urgency, a remarkable idea took shape. A nuclear-powered airplane, an aircraft that could remain aloft for days, perhaps weeks, without landing. The concept was both elegant and unsettling. If a reactor could replace conventional fuel, a bomber might circle the globe indefinitely, always ready, always present, a moving symbol of deterrence. In theory, it offered near-limitless endurance. In practice, it demanded that an active nuclear system be placed inside a machine built to vibrate, climb, descend, and survive the chaos of flight. Shielding the crew would add enormous weight. A crash would risk scattering radioactive material across land or sea. The dream of endless range carried with it the shadow of endless consequence. During the Cold War, such risks did not automatically end a project. They often accelerated it. Tests were conducted, designs were refined. A heavily modified aircraft carried a working reactor to study how such a system might behave in the air, even if the reactor did not power the engines directly. Scientists and military planners kept pushing, measuring, calculating, trying to decide whether strategic advantage could justify such a machine. In the end, the idea was overtaken by other realities. Intercontinental missiles advanced. A nuclear bomber began to look less practical than it had on paper. The project faded, leaving behind technical insights and a lingering sense of disbelief. Still, its brief life tells us something enduring. Faced with fear, humanity does not only build weapons, it builds possibilities so extreme that they seem to belong to another branch of history. And then, just as quietly, it steps back and lets the horizon close again. What if the next battlefield was not the sea itself, but the invisible force moving through it? Long before digital warfare entered everyday language, military planners were already thinking in terms that felt almost abstract. Not just ships and torpedoes, but energy, pressure, detection, misdirection. The ocean had always hidden things well. During the Cold War, that mystery became strategic. Submarines disappeared beneath polar ice in deep water. Sonar listened through miles of darkness. And somewhere within that contest, researchers began exploring whether sound and pressure could do more than locate an enemy. They might disorient, manipulate, or even harm from a distance. Among the lesser-known efforts of the era were investigations into acoustic and psychophysical effects in marine environments. Some of these were practical and documented: how low-frequency sound travels, how pressure waves affect the body, how underwater acoustics might confuse navigation or interfere with human perception. Other stories move further into rumor, suggesting experiments with resonance, behavior control, or devices meant to provoke fear, nausea, or cognitive disruption without leaving visible wounds. That is where the line begins to blur. The ocean is a difficult witness. Its evidence disperses. Its tests can be explained as routine research, weapons development, or environmental study. For outsiders, the difference is often impossible to see. What remains is a pattern of inquiry shaped by one central belief: that war increasingly depends on mastery of the unseen. Not only what can be fired, but what can be felt. Not only what destroys structures, but what unsettles minds. This is what makes such experiments linger in public memory. They suggest a shift in human conflict from impact to influence, from force to atmosphere. Whether every whispered account is true matters less than the broader fact that militaries learn to value effects that are difficult to photograph and harder to prove. And once that threshold is crossed, a troubling thought follows close behind. If a weapon leaves no obvious crater, how long can history pretend nothing happened at all? It started with a question that sounded almost childish in its simplicity. Could the weather itself be persuaded to change sides? In war, nature is usually treated as circumstance. Rain delays in advance. Fog hides a fleet. Wind alters the path of fire and flight. But by the mid-20th century, some military planners had begun to look at clouds not as background, but as infrastructure. If a storm could be encouraged, redirected, or prolonged, then weather might become more than a condition of conflict. It might become a quiet participant in it. Research into cloud seeding began in the civilian world, carried by hope that science could ease drought or tame uncertain seasons. The principle seemed straightforward enough: introduce particles into moisture-heavy clouds and influence rainfall. Yet once the possibility existed, strategic minds took notice. During the Cold War and the conflicts that followed, weather modification slipped into military discussions, planning rooms, and covert operations. The dream was not to command the sky like a mythic god, but to nudge it just enough to make roads impassable. Supply lines slower, visibility weaker, morale thinner. There is a peculiar unease in that ambition. A bomb announces itself. A storm does not. If rain falls harder than usual, it can always be called chance. If fields flood or transport routes dissolve into mud, blame can be assigned to season, terrain, or fate. The power lies partly in deniability. To alter the environment, even subtly, is to move conflict into a register that feels less direct and perhaps more intimate. It touches daily life, not only military targets. And yet the deeper story is not simply about technology, it is about human temperament. Faced with the unpredictability of the world, we are forever tempted to convert uncertainty into leverage. We seed clouds, map winds, model oceans, and tell ourselves that control is wisdom. But the sky has a longer memory than any state. It absorbs our intentions without explaining what it keeps. And that leaves us with a haunting possibility. Once we begin to treat nature as a weapon, do we ever fully remember how to see it as a home? What if the most consequential battles were fought not across borders, but inside the quiet architecture of the human mind? By the middle of the Cold War, fear had become a method. Nations were no longer studying only missiles, aircraft, and codes. They were studying endurance, obedience, trauma, and the fragile threshold between resistance and surrender. Intelligence agencies and military researchers wanted to know how much pressure memory could absorb, how identity could be weakened, and whether consciousness itself might be made more useful to the state. Out of that climate came a web of experiments, some documented, others still argued over, all circling the same unsettling premise. The mind could be entered like territory. Hypnosis, sensory deprivation, psychoactive drugs, sleep disruption, forced suggestion, extreme interrogation techniques. These were explored in different combinations, often under the language of national security or behavioral science. The official purpose varied. Some projects sought protection against enemy brainwashing. Others aimed to discover whether loyalty, truth-telling, or perception could be manipulated under controlled conditions. The scientific record is uneven and in many cases morally devastating. Declassified material has shown that some experiments crossed clear ethical lines, using vulnerable subjects or obscuring consent. Around those confirmed programs grew a wider halo of suspicion. Stories of erased memories, induced personalities, and hidden methods that left no visible scar. Not every account can be verified, but the fear behind them is easy to understand. Once institutions begin treating the inner life as a system to be engineered, trust becomes difficult to restore. What makes these histories endure is not only their secrecy, it is the intimacy of the violation. A destroyed building can be photographed. A compromised memory cannot. And so the deepest wound may not be what was done, but what uncertainty remains afterward. If a person can no longer fully trust what they remember, where does the boundary of the self truly begin? In the end, these experiments force us toward a painful truth. The human mind is powerful, but it is also vulnerable to those who mistake understanding for permission. The desert has a way of making secrecy feel natural. Stand far enough from any city, and the world begins to simplify. Heat trembles on the horizon. Mountains flatten into silhouettes. Sound seems to travel farther, while meaning drifts away. It was in landscapes like these that some of the most ambitious military experiments of the modern era were tested. Far from scrutiny, beneath open sky, where distance itself became a form of protection. In that emptiness, rumors of exotic aircraft, unconventional propulsion, and technologies that seemed years ahead of their time began to gather like mirages. Some of those projects were real enough to later enter the historical record. High-altitude reconnaissance planes, stealth designs, radical prototypes built for missions the public was never meant to imagine. Others remained suspended between witness testimony and folklore. Craft that moved too strangely, accelerated too quickly, or appeared to challenge ordinary aerodynamics. Around remote test ranges, especially in the American West, the boundary between classified engineering and cultural myth grew unusually thin. One fed the other. Each secret flight invited a larger theory. What matters here is not simply whether every extraordinary sighting can be explained. It is that the Cold War rewarded invention that looked impossible until it was suddenly ordinary. A black aircraft hidden for years could emerge and change the future of aviation. A prototype dismissed as fantasy could later become doctrine. Under those conditions, disbelief lost some of its certainty. The implausible had earned a place at the table. This is why the desert became more than a location. It became a psychological stage on which modern power rehearsed its most daring ideas. There, imagination and engineering met under military discipline, and the public learned to live with a strange possibility that the sky we thought we understood was being rewritten overhead. And perhaps that is the deeper reflection these hidden test ranges leave behind. Progress often arrives looking like a rumor first, and by the time it is acknowledged, the world has already changed around it. What if the oldest dream of war was not to strike harder, but to become nearly impossible to see? By the late 20th century, visibility itself had become a liability. Armies had always used camouflage, shadows, misdirection, and decoys. But modern detection systems changed the scale of the problem. Radar did not care how carefully a vehicle blended into the landscape. Infrared sensors could find heat and darkness. Satellites widened the field of observation until concealment began to feel temporary, almost nostalgic. In response, military research turned toward a more radical ambition, not just hiding forces, but redesigning them to slip through the gaze of machines. Some of that history is now familiar. Stealth aircraft emerged from years of classified work, shaped by mathematics, material science, and a new understanding of how surfaces scatter energy. Their strange angles were not aesthetic choices. They were arguments made in geometry, crafted to confuse radar and reduce the echo that would normally reveal an aircraft's presence. Alongside those efforts came broader research into low observable coatings, thermal masking, signal suppression, and battlefield deception. Yet beyond the confirmed programs, more speculative ideas took root. Stories circulated about active camouflage, adaptive surfaces, and systems that might bend light, distort perception, or create the impression of absence where something very real was present. Some of these concepts belong to early-stage theory. Others may have been exaggerated by distance and secrecy, but all of them were animated by the same strategic realization. In an age of total surveillance, invisibility is no longer a trick. It becomes a form of power. There is something revealing in that pursuit. Human conflict, for all its brutality, often evolves towards subtlety. The most decisive advantage may belong not to the loudest weapon, but to the force that goes unseen until the moment of consequence. And that changes more than tactics. It changes psychology. When detection can no longer be trusted, certainty itself begins to erode. We are left with a quieter, more unsettling question. If technology keeps teaching us how to disappear, what happens to a world built on the assumption that seeing is the same as knowing? It started with the moon, or rather with the fear of who might reach it first. In the years when rockets were still shedding the language of science fiction, space became more than a destination. It became a strategic height no mountain could rival. Above the atmosphere, there were no borders in the usual sense, only trajectories, timing, and the unsettling possibility that whoever mastered orbit might also master surveillance, communication, and the psychology of global power. In that climate, military planners did not look at the moon merely as a symbol. Some looked at it as terrain. Among the most haunting chapters of that era were studies and proposals for extraterrestrial military infrastructure, lunar outposts, missile platforms, orbital bombardment concepts, and systems that imagined space as the next extension of deterrence. Not all of these plans advanced beyond paper, and some remain speculative exercises rather than operational programs. But their existence reveals the logic of the time. If every frontier on Earth had been measured in strategic terms, why would the sky be any different once it became reachable? There is a strange intimacy to these documents and design concepts. Engineers drew habitation modules for lifeless ground. Strategists calculated launch windows to a body human beings had previously known only through poetry, myth, and tides. The moon, once a mirror for longing, was momentarily recast as a platform of advantage. It was not enough to arrive there. The impulse was to secure it, defend it, and perhaps weaponize the silence. In the end, much of this remained unrealized, checked by penal logistics, treaties, and perhaps a lingering sense that some thresholds should not be crossed so casually. Still, the plans matter. They show how quickly wonder can be translated into strategy when fear enters the room. And they leave behind a question larger than the Cold War itself. When humanity reaches a new frontier, Do we arrive first as explorers? Or do we bring our oldest instincts with us and call them progress? What if the most enduring military experiment was not a machine at all, but a system for shaping what people believed they have seen? Modern power depends on more than weapons. It depends on narrative, on timing, on the ability to release one fact while concealing another. During the 20th century, as intelligence agencies refined surveillance and psychological operations, deception matured into a discipline of its own. Decoys were built, false signals transmitted, misleading evidence planted, and public explanations carefully arranged around events that could not be fully acknowledged. In wartime, this was strategy. In peacetime, it often became habit. Some operations were concrete and brilliantly practical. Inflatable tanks, fabricated radio traffic, staged movements, and phantom units helped mislead enemies about invasions and troop strength. Later efforts became more sophisticated, blending media management, classified technology, and behavioral insight. A strange sight in the sky might be allowed to remain unexplained if confusion served a broader purpose. An experimental aircraft could be hidden behind ridicule or behind silence. Truth did not always need to be replaced. It only needed to be delayed. That is where military secrecy begins to overlap with something more intimate, perception itself. If institutions learn to shape the context around an event, they do not merely hide information. They influence memory while it is being formed. Witnesses start to doubt their own senses. Citizens learn to sort the world through official tone rather than direct evidence. Over time, uncertainty becomes normalized. People grow accustomed to not knowing whether the story before them is incomplete, curated, or quietly engineered. This may be the most powerful experiment of all, because it extends beyond any single program or decade. It asks how reality is experienced in an age of managed appearances. Not whether every unexplained event is stone-edged, but whether modern societies can still tell the difference between secrecy used for protection and secrecy used to shape consent. And once that distinction begins to fade, another question follows. In a world trained to look away from what it cannot verify, how much truth disappears simply because uncertainty has become easier to live with? The ocean floor, like the desert, invites a certain kind of imagination. It is vast, difficult to observe, impatient enough to keep human secrets for generations. During the Cold War, military attention turned repeatedly toward the deep sea, not only as a route for submarines, but as a hidden architecture of communication, detection, and survival. Underwater listening networks stretched across strategic corridors. Research expanded into deep diving operations, covert retrieval missions, and the possibility of placing equipment where no ordinary witness would ever see it. The seabed became something more than geology. It became infrastructure. Some of these efforts were practical responses to obvious needs. If cables carried information across oceans, then they could be protected, tapped, or disrupted. If a vessel sank with sensitive material aboard, then recovery became urgent, even at extraordinary costs. If submarines could vanish beneath ice or descend beyond ordinary reach, then the race to hear them first took on an almost mythic intensity. Technology followed that urgency downward. Pressure-resistant vessels, robotic systems, specialized habitats, and operations designed to function in darkness so complete it feels almost philosophical. Around those confirmed realities grew a wider halo of speculation. Accounts surfaced of hidden undersea facilities, long-term military installations beneath remote waters, and projects so compartmentalized that even participants saw only fragments of the whole. Some claims remain unverified. Others likely blend real engineering with the natural exaggeration that secrecy invites. But the underlying truth is simpler and in some ways more haunting. Modern warfare learned to extend itself into places once associated only with mystery. There is something revealing in that descent. Human beings do not merely fear the unknown. We are drawn to organize it. We place sensors in silence, structures in darkness, systems in spaces that once belonged to imagination alone. And yet the deep retains its dignity. It accepts our machines without surrendering its scale. Perhaps that is why these submerged histories endure in the mind. They remind us that even at the height of military ambition, there are realms we enter only partially, mistaking access for understanding and presence for mastery. What if the final frontier of military ambition was not distance, force, or even secrecy, but time? Few ideas have gripped the modern imagination more powerfully than the possibility of slipping outside ordinary chronology. To move faster than rivals is one thing, to anticipate them is another. But to interfere with time itself, to bend sequence, perception, or causality, belongs to a category that feels less like engineering and more like mythology. And yet in the ecosystem of Cold War rumor, advanced physics, and compartmentalized research, this idea refused to disappear. Stories accumulated around alleged experiments involving temporal distortion, nonlinear perception, and technologies said to affect the relationship between space, energy, and duration. Some accounts emerged from the same orbit as radar research, electromagnetic testing, and witness testimony tied to earlier naval mysteries. Others were attached to facilities where secrecy itself encouraged imaginative expansion. A subject disappears, a signal behaves strangely, a gap appears in memory. Before long, the language of ordinary explanation begins to fail, and people reach for the only framework large enough to contain what they think they have heard. Time was altered. There is no verified historical record proving that governments learned to open doors through chronology. Most physicists would regard such claims with deep skepticism, and rightly so. But the persistence of these narratives is still worth taking seriously, not as proof of impossible devices, but as evidence of a deeper cultural condition. The 20th century taught people to expect radical breakthroughs hidden behind official silence. Once atomic energy, stealth technology, and orbital flight became real, the boundary between plausible secrecy and implausible fantasy grew harder to defend emotionally, even when reason held the line. That is why the myth of time experimentation lingers. It expresses a desire older than modern war, not merely to survive history, but to outrun it, to revise mistakes before they harden, to return to lost moments, to know consequences in advance. And perhaps that is the most human part of the story. Beneath every grand rumor about time lies a quieter longing, the wish that knowledge could save us not only from enemies, but from regret itself. By the time these stories fade into archives, rumor, and the half-light of cultural memory, a pattern begins to emerge. Each experiment, whether firmly documented or only partially glimpsed, reflects the same enduring impulse. Faced with danger, nations try to enlarge the possible. They test the limits of propulsion, perception, endurance, concealment, influence, even reality itself. Sometimes they succeed in ways later generations accept as ordinary. Sometimes they fail and leave almost nothing behind but technical debris, sealed reports, and a lingering atmosphere of unease. And sometimes the record fractures so completely that what survives is no longer a clean history, but an argument between evidence and imagination. That ambiguity is not a weakness in the story. It is the story. Secrecy does not simply hide answers. It changes the shape of the questions people feel permitted to ask. It teaches witnesses to doubt themselves, researchers to work around absences, and citizens to live with the possibility that the world is being altered somewhere beyond view. Over time, that uncertainty becomes a cultural condition. We inherit not only technologies, but habits of perception formed in their shadow. And yet there is another way to read these vanished programs. Beneath the military logic, beneath the budgets and code names, there is something unmistakably human. Curiosity, fear, ingenuity under pressure. The same species that writes symphonies and studies distant galaxies also builds classified machines in the desert and probes the edges of consciousness in locked rooms. Our contradictions do not cancel each other out. They travel together, often under the same roof. So as this journey nears its end, the question is no longer whether every erased experiment happened exactly as later storytellers claimed. The deeper question is what kind of civilization repeatedly reaches for hidden knowledge when it feels most threatened. What do these projects reveal about our faith in control, our fear of vulnerability, and our difficulty accepting limits? Perhaps the answer is neither triumph nor condemnation. Perhaps it is simply this. Whenever humanity tries to master the unknown, it also exposes what it most deeply fears within itself. In the end, what remains is not a neat inventory of secret machines and vanished programs. What remains is a portrait of the modern human condition. We have walked through deserts where prototypes crossed the sky before language existed for them, through coastal stations where rumor and memory fused into legend, through laboratories that treated weather, sound, and the mind as variables to be measured and, perhaps, directed. We have looked outward toward the moon and downward into the sea and inward toward the fragile territory of perception itself. Some of these histories are anchored in documents. Others live in testimony, conjecture, and the persistent echo of things never fully resolved. But together they tell one story. When fear accelerates imagination, secrecy becomes both shield and mirror. That mirror reflects something larger than military ambition. It reflects us, our longing to know more than we should, our willingness to mistake reach for wisdom, our habit of believing that if a frontier exists, it must eventually be crossed, organized, and turned to advantage. Yet every hidden experiment also carries a quieter lesson. Knowledge is never purely technical. It changes the moral weather around those who wield it. It asks not only what can be done, but what is altered in the people who choose to do it. Perhaps that is why these erased histories still hold us. Not because they promise easy revelation, but because they remind us how incomplete every age's self-understanding really is. Beneath official timelines, beneath monuments and textbooks, there are always submerged currents of trial and error, brilliance and blindness, courage and concealment. The future is often built there first, in places the public is not meant to see. And so the final question is not whether every secret will one day be uncovered. Some will not. Records disappear. Witnesses fade. Silence hardens. The deeper question is how we choose to live with what remains unknown. With humility, perhaps. With curiosity, certainly. And with the enduring hope that whatever knowledge the future uncovers, it will be guided less by domination than by understanding. Because history does not only ask what we were capable of, it asks what kind of people we hope to become.